Hello, and welcome to the WildBlue podcast, perspectives on aviation lives, lifestyles, and business.
Hi, this is Chris Kirk along with Todd Mitten for the WildBlue podcast. And today's episode is actually brought to you by our WildBlue Buyer's Agent Services. So are you tired of chasing down airplanes that are misrepresented or that have already been sold? If so, and you're looking to get the right airplane the first time, give us a call. So Todd and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the red flags that we see in the buying process today, and statements people say, things that they do, things that should raise the hair on the back of your neck if you are in the buying process, whether it's your first time or your 10th time. It really doesn't matter. We tend to see these very things over and over again. So Todd, good to have you. Good to be here with you today. And I'll just let you throw something out. You got anything that you see as a red flag?
Well, hey, Chris, it is nice to be back. I always enjoy our opportunities to chat like this. And certainly I think this is an interesting topic that buyers are going to be, find interesting. You may be aware, like you said, people may know about this already, but a lot of the airplanes or owners that we talk to actually have a perfect airplane. I wish I had a perfect airplane, Chris. Do you? Yours is perfect. Yours is close to perfect. I know. But I think that's the first one that maybe would raise a red flag, because I think there are no perfect airplanes. What do you think?
Yeah. Airplane owners, you and I are the same way. You're proud of your airplane. You want to paint it in the best light, right?
Right.
But sometimes, this is something that we see, is that a lot of airplane owners don't really they're really not out there in the mix of the general aviation community, and don't really have anything current to compare their airplane with.
That's a great point. You'll have guys with an older radio. Let's pick not even one that old, but a 430 WASP, for example. Good radio and everything. Frankly, just getting a little long in the tooth now in comparison to what's out there. But some owners, what you're referring to, they don't realize it. It's worked for them, and they've flown with that radio for 15 years. And it's got them down on some approaches and all, and for them, that's the perfect radio. The next guy may not see it that way, however. So the owner tends to overvalue that piece of equipment.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and that is the airplane is probably, when they say this, it's probably perfect for them, but maybe not perfect in terms of flawless, because we'll hear owners say this about an airplane, and then you'll go and we go and see every airplane that we represent, and so we'll go and see it, and there'll be the typical stuff. There'll be chips on the leading edges. There'll be maybe a leak or two here or there.
A stain on the carpet, something like that.
Yeah, and you'll ask the owner about that. Well, it's there's always a story about it. So, we don't bring up that they told us it was perfect, but sometimes.
I think you brought up the first lesson of what we're trying to convey today, and that is that if the owner says it's perfect, it may be perfect for him or her, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. But you should go into it as a buyer then with an open mind, understand that they are emotionally attached to their airplane, not with a goal to offend them, but you have to. That's a balance that we can eventually talk about, like how do you balance not offending somebody with telling them their thoughts. So that's a good one.
Well, it does contrast a little bit here. It's probably a good little segue with buyers who, especially through the pre-purchase inspection process, we see this, and shops too, that they try to turn this used airplane into a new one. And so they expect all these items to be, factory fresh, to be, freshly signed off. And that's not reality. The reality is you're buying a used airplane that's going to have some warts on it. And some things that may not have been complied with, but it's still operating legally. Or sometimes, and Todd, you'll know that, I won't share the airplane, but you'll know the instance I'm talking about here, where we had a mechanic go flying with the buyer. doing a test flight, and the mechanic makes mention of the airplane not having, I don't remember what it was. Well, this airplane doesn't have altitude hold. And then all of a sudden, the buyer is worried about, well, gosh, you guys didn't tell me it didn't have altitude hold. Well, yeah, actually we did, and you're not buying an airplane with altitude hold, so you can't expect it to have everything that you want to have with it. Mechanics sometimes are notorious for introducing items into the transaction that really have no bearing with it. You're buying a 30-year-old airplane that's got a 30-year-old autopilot. Yes, you're right. It is not a GFC 700.
So how do you, as a buyer, how do you approach that? How do you balance that that mindset? The airplane is what it is. We talk about this a lot. You may want it to be something, or the mechanic or your buddy you brought with you to go fly along. That's another person who will speak up like what the incident you're referring to. But they may have an opinion of what things should have, but it doesn't necessarily have that. So we have to, as buyers, we have to reconcile that it sort of is what it is. Now, what it is has value. What you wish it had has value too, but they're not the same values. We're buying what it is versus what we wish it were.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I guess red flag number one, though, getting back on topic here that I kind of got us down a rabbit trail, is people that tell you the airplane is perfect. Another one kind of segueing into that is
better than new.
You do it.
There could be I've thought of an example of better than new. Maybe you're buying an old Piper P18 or something like that. PA18, I should say, Super Cub, and they've got new radios in it that maybe it is better than new. I don't know. But in general, while we hear that term better, and really what we're getting at, Chris, is airplanes that have had damage that have been repaired.
Right.
And so you're the one that said this first, and I just think this is so important to point out. An airplane, if it's better than new after it was repaired, why wouldn't you intentionally go out and damage your airplane so as to fix it better than new? There is not really better than new. It can be repaired to the level that is like new or close to like new, but if a owner tells you his airplane is better than new, that's a red flag.
It is a red flag, and the question that you have to think about is, if you have two airplanes that are identical, whatever they may be, let's just use an A36 for example. Two Bonanzas, they're identical, and one has had a gear up and one hasn't. The one that's had the gear up was fixed to the quote-unquote better than new standards, and the other one wasn't. They're asking the same price. Which one are you going to want?
Which one? That's the question.
Are you going to pay a premium for the better than new airplane, or are you going to pay more for the one that has never had a blemish on it?
Yeah.
I think most of us can answer that question pretty honestly and pretty quickly. And so as soon as a guy tells you it's better than new, he's trying to sell you on the fact that, hey, it's had damage history. Frankly, we just believe, just to disclose what damage history it's had. People, for the most part, are reasonable. They understand airplanes have had things happen to them. I mean, they're moving pieces of machinery. Something's going to happen at some point.
Honestly, one of the, I guess you would call it the more art aspect of our job, one of the arts of our role as aircraft brokers is assessing what is the value of that damage or damage history. Repaired properly, and that's the first thing I know we both always look at. We look at the logbooks, and we do our best to ascertain, was this airplane repaired, and even we take a look at them pretty closely when we go see them. We're underneath the airplane looking around and crawling around. So you as a buyer, whether you're using a or working through a broker or buying from an individual or whatever, also are going to have to do that and assess what you think, if the airplane does have damage history, what you think that's worth in affecting the value of that airplane.
Right. And we don't want to take anything away from some shops out there that are absolutely top-notch, top-tier shops. We know, for example, that if an airplane has a gear up, or it has some other significant damage, we would prefer to see certain shops in the logs that have been through that airplane to give us and the future owners the confidence they need that this thing was repaired properly. But that still doesn't make it better than new.
No.
Because if it was better than new, then they would have done that. They would have damaged it at the factory and sold it that way.
Well, it is important to point out, though, too, that damage history is not the end of the world, but it just needs to be considered in any aircraft purchase. I would buy an airplane that has been damaged if I knew it was repaired properly and the circumstances were otherwise right. It's accounted for in the value and all that. I mean, I'll be honest, I would do it.
So you buy an airplane with damage history that wasn't just buffed out?
Well, that'll buff out. Chris knows that's one of my little pet peeves. You cannot read an internet forum where an aircraft has been damaged, usually wrecked, where somebody doesn't have to put, it'll buff out. At some point, that joke has lost its humor in my life. So
sometimes they're serious. That's what the scary part of it is.
That's true. That is true. Duct tape and baling wire.
Yeah.
So if the you had commented the other day about this thought, and I'm curious what you're getting at when you talk about if a seller says the price is firm, it's $150,000 firm or whatever. What do you why is that a red flag to you?
Most of what it shows me is that they're going to be tough to work with. They're going to be just a bear, and maybe not, but more times than not, the only time you'll see firm is when it's a for sale by owner airplane, which brings its own challenges with it. But when there's firm, to me, it just is like, okay, I'm not even going to call. It's kind of like people not posting their prices.
Yes,
on the other end
I knew that's where you're. Yes,
because that's irritating to me as well. Post the price, open the door, let somebody come in and have a conversation. That's what we want to do. We want to have a conversation with people because we never know where it's going to go. Buyers change their minds, sellers change their minds, market changes. Yes. Who knows? And so firm just tells me, I've got my heels stuck in the mud, and I'm just not going to move or budge or really probably give you much information at all. That's just my experience.
Okay, well, and that's a valid point. I think that that you're going to get a feel for the buyer or the seller, I should say, as you work with them. Honestly, most people you talk to are pretty nice overall, though. But you will come across that guy now and then who you just have immediately a personality conflict with. But let's go down that path for a minute. It's maybe not a red flag, but you call, let's say you call about a guy who has his airplane for sale by owner, and he says something that you don't like that's a red flag to you right away, but you really think his airplane might be still one that you want. How do you approach that as a buyer? How do you smooth things over, or what do you think? I mean, you got any thoughts on that?
First off, and that's a good question. But first off, I think if something doesn't feel right or doesn't smell right, it's probably not right.
Yeah.
So you've got to, at some point as a buyer, relinquish your emotional attachment to that airplane. I know airplanes are emotional. People get emotional about them all the time. We try to discourage against that because it really keeps you from making a wise business decision on the airplane. But if it just doesn't look right, sound right, then just be willing to say, hey, thanks for your time and hang up. If you're not the kind of person that can really ask a lot of questions and maybe ask the same question 2 or 3 different ways to try to figure out what's going on. But if you feel like that seller is not fully disclosing or being transparent with you, I don't care how nice the airplane is, you gotta walk away from it, because you ultimately at the end of the day you need to have the trust and the confidence so that after you sign the dotted line, you're not turning around over your shoulders to deal with somebody. And frankly, there's some folks out there that are tough to deal with. They're just bears. They're not friendly. And Todd, you had something today that I thought was freaking funny. That ad that you saw from a FSBO seller. What was that?
Yeah, he he says in his ad, "Don't call me to." He had a couple comments. I can't think of the first one. The second was, "Don't call me to talk about the airplanes you've owned." I thought that was really funny. But it is, as a seller, people have to deal with those kinds of callers. So I would say, as a buyer, don't be that guy. Be serious before you call somebody.
Yeah, be serious. And if you are selling, if you're predisposed to be that way, if you're not the quote unquote people person, or you just don't have time, then hire somebody to work with you to sell the airplane. They're going to save you tons of headache. We get that comment over and over again, like, "Man, Chris, I just don't want to deal with buyers." Okay, fine, we'll deal with them.
Yeah.
Happy to answer questions for them.
Because we do talk a lot to people who are just searching for information, but that's part of our job. We provide that. That's what we do. But you may be in a situation as a seller where you don't have the time to offer that, to just chat with the guy about, hey, in general, A36s are great airplanes because of this. So that's a key point. I wanted to ask, what if the buyer, or what if the seller doesn't want to do something that you feel is necessary to evaluate the airplane? For example, do a test flight, or or there just somehow isn't a possibility of doing a test flight, or worse yet, a pre-buy. I know what I think I would do, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, at some point you may have to walk away.
Yeah.
But at some point, here's the thing too, though. As a buyer, you need to understand that it's not always reasonable to ask the seller for a test flight without you making some kind of commitment. These guys and sellers all over, whether it's a broker like us or an individual, they get people that want to come in and fly their airplane, and then you don't ever hear from them again. Mm-hmm. So you need to be as a buyer, stand up and say, "Hey, I'm willing to make a commitment on this airplane, contingent upon me liking it. Then I'll get my deposit back, or I can walk away from it, or the contract's null and void, or however you want to word it." But you, as the buyer, need to also realize you can't be loosey goosey and expect the seller to go along with you all the way. That being said, if the seller is very unaccommodating and at no point wants to do a test flight or a pre-buy, then those are things you need to be able to do as a buyer, just to basic due diligence. So is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I would agree completely. You have to be able to have access to those things. Now, it's not every airplane, I suppose, needs a test flight, but we sell airplanes off and on where there is no test flight involved, but most of them do. The majority do. Sure. People like to test things. So as a buyer, especially on the test flight, kind of talking about that for a minute, what do you tell, or do you tell buyers things that they may want to look at specifically during the test flight?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So if we're representing the buyer as a buyer's agent, then I'll work with that buyer and say, okay, whether I'm going along for the test flight, or they're going to do it, or we're having somebody else do it, I'll have a list of things specific to that airplane that we want to look at. So let's say it's a Piper Mirage or a Meridian. We're going to look at pressurization and see how the system is working. But we're going to also want to look at avionics. So there's specific avionics components in there that have known issues. We're going to want to look at those and make sure everything's coupling up properly, making sure the airplane flies straight. Are you having to put in an excessive amount of rudder on departure because it's not rigged properly, or is the plane just bent for some funky reason that maybe is not being disclosed? So
yeah, I always, one of the big, you mentioned it a little bit, you said coupled up, but the autopilot is really an important thing to have it. You want to see it track a localizer, track a glide slope, or an LPV approach or something like that. That's for most buyers, that's a key. That's something you really want to look at on a test flight.
Yeah, and it's just that one last little thing to make sure that the plane is operating per the specs that you were given. And some things may be inoperative, and you may know about that.
That's the beauty. If it's an airplane you're moving up to, And since you brought up a Mirage, for example, that's a good, or Meridian, but any PA-46, and you've never flown something like that before, that's when it's good to have someone is helping you along in the purchase process. Because if you're really, that's probably the time to really think about a buyer's agent scenario, I think, isn't it? Where, you're really stepping up into an area that you're not, maybe, you've flown Saratogas, but pressurization, things like that are all new to you, higher operating in the flight levels, things of that nature. And that's, so it brings up some additional questions and concerns, which expertise you may or may not have at that point. So.
Yeah, and then I think maybe we can reserve that for a different podcast, because you just triggered a bunch of things, and that's a great point. But getting back to some of the red flags, one of the other things that I like to look at is pictures and what they provide, and moreover what they don't provide. Are these pictures all 30-foot pictures where the paint looks great and the interior looks great? Are they showing you little nuances, nicks and chips and dents and hanger rash and torn fabric and stains and all that kind of stuff? So if they're not willing to provide something, then make sure you're asking. There's a fair number of brokers. It still boggles my mind that don't see the airplanes they represent. They're given those pictures from the seller because that's what the seller wants them to see, or they just frankly don't know what they're taking a picture of. So I think as another red flag, if you see something or you're not seeing something that you're wanting to see and they're not being cooperative about getting it to you, there's probably a reason. We hear, and tell me if you agree with this, Todd. I hear, and I think we all hear, buyers who call us up and just kind of moan and cry for a little while about the number of listings they've gone to see and how they have not been at all what they thought they were going to be. Those aren't our listings, and I can say that unequivocally. In 15 years of doing this, I think we've had one person ever mention that to us. And the reason is we go and look at those airplanes,
yes,
and we're very diligent about taking pictures and showing things that aren't perfect. But occasionally we'll miss something. But we get that comment a lot.
Well, we're not representing the airplane we wish it were. We're representing the airplane that it is. And I tell people that all the time, both potential clients and buyers, because that's just the facts. I would love it if it were better than new, but it's not. So yeah. And when you're looking at pictures, to your point, if you need to see more, a lot of these airplanes are halfway across the country. It'd be great if the airplane you're buying is at the next airport over. That happens, definitely, but a lot of times, especially as you get into the nicer airplanes that are less common, not just 172s or Piper Warriors that are pretty prevalent, but airplanes that are lesser in numbers, you may have to travel 3-4 states away to go see it. So you would like that information. So as a buyer, I think you need to, if you're talking seriously with a seller and there's some things you can't see, before you spend the time, money, and effort to go see it, you may want to ask for more pictures, especially if you're concerned about a specific aspect of that airplane too, right, or of that type of airplane.
So one of the red flags popped up in my mind here before we go, and that deals with pricing. So let me ask you this. What is it a buyer has to watch out for in regards to how a seller has a plane priced? And where I'm going with this is particularly with upgrades that they've done. So you get these sellers that have put X number of dollars in there, and they are absolutely certain that X number of dollars ought to come back to them. So any thoughts on how to look at that and decide whether or not you want to be the guy to try to beat this into the seller's head, or should you just move on? That's a
great point, because it seems like airplane after airplane out there has had $100,000 spent on it in the last year, and that's a lot of money, and chances are you're not going to think that airplane's worth $100,000 more than what it would have been last year. That's just almost inevitable. So yeah, how do you approach that? That's a good question. Do you You can value things to a degree. You can value a radio at a percentage of what it costs new. That's one way to look at it. Do a little research. Go to some of the local, or go to the avionics websites, companies that sell radios, and
right.
Okay, they sell that radio for $15,000. So what do I think it's probably worth today? $10,000, $5,000, half, whatever it may be.
But you get to add all the cost of labor and all that. You get to add that to the value of the airplane, right?
No. No, sorry. When you spend money on labor, just like if it's got, and along those lines, it's if it's, we just put new tires on it or a new battery last year. Would you buy an airplane, Chris, without a battery or without tires?
No.
So probably those don't add the value. If the battery costs you $300, it's not worth $300 more. It's part of it.
Yeah.
So
sometimes, and if you read between the lines, I think on pricing, and especially if you just listen a lot to what the seller is saying, and you just try to figure out what's really going on, it becomes apparent that if they're trying to scrimp every last nickel and dime they've spent on that airplane out of there, I have found, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I've found more often than not that those are the same types of sellers who really haven't spent a lot on maintenance. They've probably been skimping themselves on doing the full, and so they want to get every nickel and dime out of you, but when it comes time to turn the tables, they really don't want to spend the nickels and dimes and dollars and AMUs on doing it the right way either. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that is a fair assessment. The money spent, it's just airplanes take a lot of AMUs to run, to maintain, to upgrade, and all that. It's part of it, and you're not going to get it all back at the end of the day. You're just not.
Yep. And if you don't know what an AMU is, it's kind of a joke, but aircraft monetary unit is what that stands for, and each aircraft monetary unit equals $1,000. So it's easier to explain to your wife or husband that you're spending 8 AMUs than this thing is going to cost me $8,000.
Yeah.
So just a little way to soften all the expenses that are involved with general aviation ownership. So, well, listen, let's wrap this up. Todd, thanks. Is there anything else you can think of?
No, I think
I
hope that helps the buyers a little bit, gives you some thoughts. Certainly, we'd be happy to talk to you, answer questions, and maybe we can help you in a buying situation when you say.
Yeah, I absolutely. We'd love to work with you. We work with a number of customers who are doing just that. They've had trouble finding the right airplane. They've been led down the primrose path more times than they care to be, and they want to just have somebody that's there to watch their interests, and ultimately 2 to 3 years down the road after their purchase, they can look back and say, wow, that was a great experience. I've saved some money here, and I've got into the right airplane the first time, and that's what our goal is. So if we can help you out at all, Todd, me, Chris, or our Mac, we'd love to visit with you, 888-773-4249, or check us out at flywildblue.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the WildBlue podcast. Find us online at flywildblue.com. And don't forget to subscribe and share.